The spring rain had turned the gravel drive to a wet mirror, and from his perch on the gallery balustrade, Edward, Viscount Hartley, watched the carriage splash to a halt. He was 12, old enough to know that his father's return from London should have been announced by a single outrider, not by the vivid flash of a woman's crimson pelisse emerging from the coach door. The boy's hands tightened on the carved oak rail. His father, Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Greywood, stepped down with the careful grace of a man long accustomed to being watched. But his gaze was not for the house, nor for the footmen stiffening at their posts. It was for the woman beside him, whose laugh rang out like a bell struck too hard. She was all dark curls and knowing eyes, her gown a shade of claret that spoke of lavish expense and questionable taste. Celeste Fontaine. Edward had heard the name murmured among the servants, a name that made his mother's lady's maid press her lips thin. Below in the entrance hall's cold grandeur the Duchess waited. Margaret Ashworth stood exactly where she had stood 100 times before, to welcome her husband home from Parliament, from hunting, from the clubs of St. James's. Her gown was dove-grey, unadorned save for the pearls at her throat, a gift from her own father, not the Duke. Edward saw her spine like a steel blade beneath the silk. She did not step forward. She did not recoil. She simply existed in the doorway of her own home, as if the woman on her husband's arm were a mild inconvenience of weather. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice as smooth as the surface of a lake at dawn, "you have brought a guest. I shall have a room prepared in the east wing." The Duke's brows drew together, a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps surprise, passing over his handsome features. He had expected either tears or icy fury. This quiet accommodation unsettled him. Celeste Fontaine smiled, slow and triumphant, and dipped into a curtsy that was just deep enough to mock. Margaret acknowledged it with a nod so slight it was almost a blink, then turned and walked up the stairs. She did not look at the woman again. She did not look at her husband. Edward pressed himself into the shadow of a marble pillar, but as his mother passed, she paused. Her hand, cool and steady, brushed his cheek. "Come, my darling," she murmured. "Help me choose a book to read tonight." That evening the house settled into a wretched silence. The Duke dined with his mistress in the formal dining room, and the clink of their glasses drifted up like a deliberate provocation. In her private sitting room, Margaret sat by the fire, a miniature portrait of Edward as a baby resting on her knee. Edward, curled on a footstool nearby, watched her trace the painted curls with her fingertip. She did not weep. Her stillness was that of a cathedral before a storm vast, holding its breath. Her lady's maid, Betsy, entered to stoke the fire and hesitated. Margaret lifted her gaze. "The Duke believes he rules here, Betsy. He believes his fortune and his title are walls I cannot scale." Her voice held no bitterness, only a diamond-hard certainty. "He has forgotten that every reign has an end, and I have been a quiet duchess long enough." Edward felt the words lodge in his chest like a promise. He did not fully understand what they meant, but he knew his mother had been wounded, and that she would not bleed where anyone could see. She would end something. The firelight carved her face into planes of light and shadow, and in that moment she looked less like a duchess and more like a general preparing for a long campaign. The first act of rebellion was a missing ledger. Mrs. Hollies, the housekeeper, discovered it absent from the estate office on Tuesday morning, and by midday no one could locate the linen inventory or the weekly butcher's order. Margaret had always managed the household accounts with a precision that made Greywood Hall run like a well-wound clock. Now, the clock simply stopped. No menus arrived for the cook. No orders for coal reached the coal merchant. Servants performed their duties by rote, but the invisible thread that held the estate together had been cut. Edward noticed the changes immediately. His lessons with Mr. Phelps continued uninterrupted in the schoolroom, but when he wandered down for luncheon, the footman's collar was slightly askew. Small signs of decay crept in. The Duke, ensconced in his study with Celeste laughing too loudly at his side, remained oblivious for 3 full days. Then the wine cellar ran low on his favorite claret, and his valet could not produce a freshly pressed coat without a specific request, and irritation began to darken his brow. Margaret, meanwhile, occupied the west-facing morning room, a space that overlooked the rose garden rather than the drive. She wrote letters to her solicitor, to her sister in Derbyshire, to the bank. She took long walks with Edward along the beach avenue, teaching him the names of trees and the habits of nesting birds. She never mentioned the woman in the east wing. She never spoke of the Duke. Her composure was a fortress, and Celeste Fontaine, finding herself unable to provoke a reaction, grew petulant. She attempted to order a new set of breakfast china, and Mrs. Hollis, with iron courtesy, informed her that only her Grace approved such expenditures. The mistress raged. The Duchess did not respond. The confrontation came in the library at dusk. Margaret was reading to Edward by the fire when the Duke strode in, his cravat undone and his face a study in controlled anger. "Leave us, Hartley," he said to his son. Edward rose reluctantly, but his mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father and I will speak later. Finish your supper and I shall come say good night." The boy went, but he lingered just outside the door, ear pressed to the oak. "You have abandoned your duties," the Duke said. "The house is descending into shambles. I will not have my comfort, my son's comfort, sacrificed to your wounded pride." Margaret closed her book and set it aside. She rose, and even in her simple moss-green day dress, she seemed to inhabit a different realm from the blustering man before her. "You brought your mistress into this house, Alexander. You seated her at my table in the hearing of my child. You wish to be seen as a man without constraints. Now you shall be. I will not manage the household of a man who renders my position a mockery. If you want order, perhaps Miss Fontaine knows how to balance a ledger." The Duke's face whitened. He was not used to being addressed so directly, so calmly. "You forget yourself," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "No," Margaret answered. "I have remembered myself at last. You may keep your mistress, you may keep your pride, but you will not keep my silent complicity. I am no longer your steward. I am your wife, and if that means nothing to you, then I shall find a life where it means something to me." She walked past him, opened the door, and found Edward standing there, eyes wide. She did not scold him. She took his hand and led him up the stairs. The Duke remained in the library, a lamp guttering beside him, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, a chill settling deep into his bones. The Marquis of Rothermere's ball at Linford Court was the first true test of the season's social tides. Lord Julian Westbrook, a widower of 2 years with a young daughter, was known for his immaculate taste and his disinclination for scandal. When the Duchess of Greywood's carriage arrived, unaccompanied by her husband, the whispers began even before she stepped down. But when she descended in sapphire velvet that matched the night sky, pearls woven into her upswept hair, the whispers changed timbre. She was not a woman in retreat. She was a sovereign. Edward had been left at Greywood under the tutelage of Mr. Phelps, but word would reach him later through Betsy's vivid retellings. Inside the ballroom, Margaret moved with quiet assurance, greeting acquaintances, deflecting pointed questions with deft grace. The other matrons, who had first clucked their tongues at her husband's open indiscretion, now watched her with a kind of cautious awe. She did not appear defeated. She appeared liberated. Lord Rothermere approached her before the first set had ended. He was tall, with a scholar's stoop and a soldier's bearing, his dark hair lightly silvered. He had known Margaret years ago, before her marriage, and he took her hand now with an old friend's warmth. "Your Grace, I am glad you came. I feared the gossip might keep you away." She smiled, a true smile that reached her eyes. "Gossip is a wind, Lord Rothermere. I choose which way I lean." They danced. The waltz had only recently been deemed acceptable, and to waltz with a man not one's husband was a statement. Margaret executed the steps with flawless poise, her hand light on Rothermere's shoulder, their conversation intimate enough to fuel a dozen rumors. He murmured that she was the most dignified woman in the room. She replied that dignity was an armor she had learned to wear long ago. The Duke arrived an hour late with Celeste on his arm, her gown a garish gold. The collective intake of breath was audible. All eyes tracked him as he scanned the room and found his wife, in the arms of another man, her head inclined toward Lord Rothermere's quiet words. Alexander Ashworth stood rigid. His mistress's grip tightened possessively, but he barely noticed. He saw only Margaret's calm face, the easy rapport between her and the Marquis. A sensation he had not felt in years clawed up his throat, jealousy, raw and unfamiliar. When the dance ended, he intercepted her near the terrace doors. "Margaret, a word." His tone brooked no refusal, but she simply looked at him, her expression placid. "If you wish to speak to me, Alexander, you may do so here. I am not leaving this ball at your summons." His jaw tightened. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, of our family." She let out a soft breath, not a sigh of exasperation but of finality. "Your spectacle arrived in a gold dress and has been glaring at me for the past quarter hour. Your rule over my evenings, over my choices, ended the moment you made our home a stage for your indiscretions. Excuse me." She extended her hand toward Lord Rothmere, who had lingered a respectful distance away. He stepped forward, and Margaret took his arm. The Duke could only watch as they walked out onto the torchlit terrace, his wife's silhouette merging with the warm glow, leaving him marooned in a sea of curious stares. The ride back to Greywood was a torment of silence for Alexander. Celeste's chatter grated. He barely answered. By the time the carriage pulled into the drive, his mind was a tangle of humiliation and a strange, nascent dread. He went straight to the east wing, where he found the door to Margaret's new suite firmly closed. A footman nervously informed him that her Grace had given strict instructions. She was not to be disturbed. In the morning, a leather-bound document lay on the desk in his study. His solicitor had sent it over at her request, a draft of articles of separation, granting her residence at Wrenwood, the dower property, along with a generous but not ruinous annuity and shared custody of Edward. It was all drafted with chilling legality, signed by her own hand. She intended to leave him, not in a flurry of passionate flight, but in cold, irrevocable ink. The Duke sat heavily, the paper trembling in his grip. He thought of Margaret as a bride, 19, full of quiet hope, her eyes bright with affection for him. Where had that affection gone? He had starved it, he knew. He had fed his own appetites and called it a husband's privilege. He had expected her to endure as duchesses had endured for centuries. But Margaret was not merely a duchess. She was the woman who read poetry to their son, who knew every tenant's name, who had once challenged him to a horse race across the heath and won. He had buried that woman under layers of neglect. A knock came and Edward entered. The boy's face was pale, his fists clenched at his sides. "Father." "No title, no your Grace." The Duke looked up, startled. "Edward Hartley, what is it?" Edward walked forward until he stood directly before the great mahogany desk. "Why did you bring that woman here to wound Mama? Do you hate us?" His voice cracked, but he held his father's gaze. "Mama does not cry, she does not shout, but I heard her praying last night. She asked God for the strength to protect me from shame, from you." Alexander felt the words like a blow to the sternum. He had no defense. He could not explain to a 12-year-old boy the tangled threads of pride, boredom, and selfishness that had led him to this precipice. He could only say hoarsely, "I do not hate you. I have been a fool." Edward's expression did not soften. "Then fix it, but I do not think you can." The boy turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. That night the Duke dismissed Celeste Fontaine with a settlement and a one-way ticket to London. She raged and wept, but he felt nothing. The house felt hollow. He roamed its corridors and stopped before the portrait of Margaret that hung in the long gallery, painted a decade ago. Her painted eyes held a gentle challenge. He had commissioned it, then promptly forgotten to look at it. Now it seemed to ask him, "What are you going to do now, Alexander?" The separation papers lay unsigned on his desk, waiting. He could fight it, drag her name through the courts, but the very thought made his stomach turn. She had ended his reign without a single shout. She had simply walked into a new wing, and the kingdom he had built for himself crumbled because its true foundation had been her quiet labor and her silent dignity. He had ruled nothing. He had only been held up by a woman he had ceased to see. 3 weeks later, the garden party at Rothmere Hall unfolded under a benevolent June sky. Margaret attended with Edward, who looked uncommonly grown-up in a new coat of blue superfine. The Duchess wore lavender muslin and a chipped straw bonnet, and she was received with a warmth that confirmed her standing in the ton had shifted. She was no longer a wronged wife to be pitied. She was the woman who had faced down a duke's arrogance with unbroken grace. Lord Rothmere was the perfect host. He walked with Margaret along the lavender borders, and their conversation was easy, punctuated by his young daughter Lily's laughter as she and Edward chased butterflies. At one point the Marquis paused by the sundial and said, "Margaret, I would be remiss if I did not speak plainly. My estate is not a dukedom, but it is prosperous and peaceful. My daughter adores you. And I have admired you from a distance for many years. If ever you are free, I hope you will allow me to offer something more than friendship." His voice was respectful, devoid of pressure. Margaret looked at him with a softness that held no promise but no rejection. "You are a good man, Julian. I am honored, but I must find my own footing before I can consider any step. I will not bring a fragmented heart into your household." Before Rothmere could respond, a stir at the garden gate drew every eye. The Duke of Greywood, coat rumpled and cravat askew, strode onto the lawn. Whispers erupted like a disturbed beehive. He was unshaven, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness. Edward stepped closer to his mother, his small frame bracing. Alexander halted a few paces away. "Margaret, please, I ask only for a moment's hearing." The silence that fell was immense. Margaret regarded him without hostility, without welcome. "Speak then, Alexander, but know that my son hears you." The Duke swallowed. He looked at Edward, then back at her. "I have dismissed Celeste. I have read the separation papers. I know I have no right to ask for anything. But I cannot sign them until I tell you I was not ruling. I was hiding from the man I should have been. You were never the problem, I was. And I am here not to demand, but to ask if there is any path back. Any at all." Margaret let the words hang in the air. A lark sang somewhere above. She looked at Rothmere, who nodded subtly, giving her space. She looked at her son, whose eyes were fixed on his father with a painful hope. Then she spoke, clear as a bell. "Your rule over this family, over my heart, ended the night you brought a mistress into our home and expected my silence. I am no longer silent. I leave for Renwood tomorrow. Edward comes with me. If you wish to find a path back, you must build it alone first. Not with apologies, but with proof. Proof that you understand what you destroyed." Edward walked forward and took his mother's hand, then faced his father. "I am going with Mama. I love you, father, but I am going with her." The Duke felt something crack deep inside, a dam breaking. He did not weep. He simply nodded, the nod of a man acknowledging a long-overdue execution. "Then go with my blessing, and I will do as you ask, Margaret. I will build something worthy of you, even if it takes years." He turned and walked away, the eyes of the ton upon his back, and for once the weight of their judgment did not matter. What mattered was the quiet sound of his wife and son leaving him in the garden, and the unbearable silence that followed. Renwood was a modest manor set among ancient oaks, its rooms filled with the scent of beeswax and lavender. Margaret arranged it with the same calm efficiency she had once brought to Greywood, creating a sanctuary for Edward and herself. The boy thrived, his laughter returning, his lessons continuing with a local tutor. But Margaret's nights were long, and she often sat by the window, looking toward the dark lane as if expecting a rider. At Greywood, the Duke did not descend into drink or despair. He did something far harder. He changed. He began by riding out to every tenant farm, listening to grievances, repairing fences, and reducing rents where harvests had failed. He dismissed his corrupt steward and hired a man of integrity. He invited his widowed sister to live at the hall, and her presence brought a warmth the house had long missed. And he wrote letters. Every week a thick envelope arrived at Renwood addressed to Edward. The letters were not lectures, they were simple accounts of a man learning humility. He described the newborn foal in the stables, the way the miller's wife had taught him to bake a tolerable loaf, the book of poetry he was reading because Margaret had once loved it. He asked about Edward's lessons and recounted his own boyhood mistakes. He never pleaded for a reply, never mentioned the separation. He simply showed up on the page. Margaret intercepted and read every letter before giving them to her son. At first, she hardened her heart, searching for manipulation. But the letters held no demand, only a steady, quiet authenticity. One evening, she found a note tucked into Edward's latest letter, addressed to her alone. It was brief. "Margaret, I do not ask you to read this. I only wish to say that I see you now. I see everything you were, everything you gave, and I am ashamed of my blindness. I am learning what it means to be a man worthy of the name, and I owe that lesson to you. Whatever comes, I am grateful for the years I had you at my side." He signed it simply, Alexander. She folded the note and placed it in her escritoire, her hand lingering on the paper. She did not write back, but she stopped dreading the post. Autumn arrived, and with it, a chill that seeped into Edward's lungs. He developed a cough that deepened into a raging fever. The local physician bled him, but the boy weakened, his face waxen against the pillows. Margaret, who had not known terror since the night her husband returned with his mistress, felt it now, a cold claw around her heart. She sent for the London doctor, but she also sent a writer to Greywood with a single line: "Edward is gravely ill. Come." The Duke arrived in the dead of night, his horse lathered, his face carved by fear. He strode past servants without a word, and when he entered Edward's sick room, he stopped. Margaret sat beside the bed, her dress rumpled, her eyes hollow. For a moment they were not Duke and Duchess, but simply a mother and father, their child burning between them. Alexander knelt beside her, not touching her, just present. He placed a gentle hand on Edward's brow and whispered, "I am here, my boy. Papa's here." Margaret watched his face crumple with a tenderness she had not seen in years. And something inside her, a locked door she had sworn never to open, shifted just a fraction. For 4 days and nights, the Duke remained at Edward's bedside. He administered cool cloths, spooned broth, and read aloud from the boy's favorite adventure novels until his voice grew hoarse. He conferred quietly with the doctor, approving every remedy. He did not once suggest that his presence was a favor to be repaid. He simply stayed. Margaret, exhausted beyond measure, eventually slept on a cot in the adjoining room, trusting him to watch over their son. On the 5th morning, Edward's fever broke. He opened his eyes and saw both his parents bending over him, their faces lined with worry and relief. "Mama," he croaked then, "Papa." The Duke's eyes glistened, but he only smiled and smoothed the boy's hair. Margaret took Edward's hand and kissed it, her own eyes bright. In that moment, the three of them were a family again, not because of any proclamation, but because of the simple, fierce love that had survived the wreckage. During Edward's convalescence, Margaret and Alexander found themselves sharing quiet hours in the parlor, watching the boy sleep on a daybed. Words came slowly at first, then more freely. Alexander described the changes at Greywood, the new irrigation system for the lower fields, the school he was funding for tenants' children, his sister's improved health. Margaret listened, asking careful questions. He did not flatter or plead. He answered with the directness of a man who had stopped performing. One afternoon, while Edward dozed and a light snow began to dust the oaks, Margaret led Alexander into the small conservatory. She stood by the frosted window and spoke without turning. "I ended your rule, Alexander, because it was a tyranny of indifference, but I did not end our marriage. I only stopped surviving it." She turned, and her gaze was clear, unafraid. "If we are to build something new, it will be a partnership. I will have my own income, my own voice. No more mistresses. No more unspoken contempt. You will court me again, and you will be patient. And Edward will see a father who respects his mother. Can you accept that?" He crossed the room, his steps heavy but certain. He did not try to embrace her. He simply took her hand, her left hand, where his ring still rested, and lifted it to his lips. "I accept everything. I have no rule left to cling to. I only have the hope of earning back what I lost, day by day." His kiss was soft, almost reverent, and Margaret felt the last shard of her frozen heart begin to melt. Spring returned, and with it, a quiet celebration at Greywood Hall. The family dined together in the intimate breakfast room, not the grand dining hall. Alexander deferred to Margaret's choices on the menu, on the arrangement of furniture, on Edward's new pony. The servants, who had witnessed the fall and the slow rise, smiled behind their hands. Edward, now 13 and thriving, watched his father laugh at something his mother said, and he knew the Duke's old rule had truly ended. It had been replaced by a strange, wonderful thing, a home where power was shared, where love was not a weapon but a sanctuary. As dusk fell and candles were lit, Margaret sat at the pianoforte and played a simple country air. Alexander stood by the window, watching her fingers move over the keys, and Edward sprawled on the carpet with a book. The Duke caught his son's eye, and the boy gave a small, satisfied nod. No words were needed. The reign of arrogance was over. In its place stood a quiet, durable kingdom built by a woman who had refused to be invisible and a man who had finally learned to see.